Hey guys, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back with another story today. So if you're new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you can get alerted to my new videos when I post them. And now on to today's topic. So today we're going to talk about the lost gold mine on the Cossatot River in southwest Arkansas. So the Cossatot River is a river that comes from the mountains and flows south down toward Louisiana. And this river, I guess Cossatot, is a Native American word that I'm not sure which language, but in one of the Native American languages, Cossatot means skull crusher. And that river is a kind of a moody river is what it's been kind of described as, where you have cascades and rapids and stuff, and then it'll smooth out and be real gentle and nice for canoeing, and so it kind of cuts through the sandstone, and it can be pretty treacherous in some areas and pretty calm in some areas. So anyhow, it curves through a lot of sandstone, and in some areas it cuts down into some igneous rock. And what they've said is during an ancient volcano, what they think happened was that gold formed in some of the seams and cracks in the rock, and then layers of sandstone were deposited on top of that, and then as the seas eventually receded back, I guess many millions of years ago, then it left the river to cut through the sandstone and be able to go down to some of the volcanic igneous rock in some places where there were some veins of gold. So the area that we're talking about is Sevier County, Arkansas, and the river in this area is cut pretty deep into the sandstone and exposed some granite with some seams of gold in it. And the Spaniards were there and had a gold mine, and eventually the Spanish basically just left the mine, and there's not a lot of documentation on the exact reason, if they mined enough or got too tough or what the situation was. So they left the mine. And so obviously many years later, just before the Civil War, there was a Dr. Ferdinand Smith that came to the area, and he settled on a rugged, forested area in kind of the bottoms of the Cossatot River. And he also was, well, he had come from the Missouri area. He had been a doctor there. There was some talk about that maybe one of his patients died up there, and it may have been one of those situations where he felt he needed to leave the area. Well, he came down here to this area of Arkansas, and they didn't have a doctor right around there, so they were all happy to have him. And he got to know a lot of the locals and talked to the locals about a lot of the history and stuff in the area. And talking to a lot of the locals, he found out about this rich, lost gold mine that was upstream a ways. And the mine was also, they said for a lot of years, it was said that the mine was linked to this blonde-haired, Spanish-speaking woman that traveled in the company of the Indians. So there was a trading post at this time at Locksburg, Arkansas, and this woman would visit that trading post maybe once a month or so for supplies. And she would ride in on a white horse, and the Indians would follow her on foot, whatever tribe this was, no one really said. And she wore lots of gold jewelry. It sounded like the jewelry was a little bit more old-fashioned for the time. and she paid for all her mining supplies with the purest gold that anyone had seen. Gold nuggets and pieces of gold that were very pure. And they said if she spoke, it was Castilian Spanish, which, if you know anything about Spanish, so you've got the Castilian Spanish, which is the type of Spanish at the time that had been spoken in Spain. And you had a lot of the Spaniards that obviously came over to Mexico, from the 1500s on, and ended up with a different dialect. So basically what happened is they recognized that her accent was like a direct from Spain, type of accent for her Spanish. And anyhow, so she had connections to the Spanish homeland. And anyhow, but they said she rarely spoke. And if followed, she would basically lose people in the dense forested, thicketed pig pen bottoms, which was one of the lower lying areas of the river, and it was just heavy with thickets and forest and everything, and so thick that if someone probably wasn't following her fairly close, they could easily lose her, and they tried to follow her a few times, I guess, some of the locals, and never were able to to follow her. So these stories were being told to Dr. Smith, and it doesn't say exactly like if they're talking that these stories were some of the people telling him the stories, if it was like their grandparents or great grandparents generation that were trying to follow this lady, or if it was more recently. So I don't know if we're talking that this woman was around there in the say the 1700s or something like that, or if this was shortly before Dr. Smith came along. It doesn't really tell you those details. But anyhow, so basically what happens is many people would become lost in the bottoms trying to follow her, and then may be lucky to find their way out. So no one was ever successful trying to follow her back to where this gold mine was. But there had been rumors about it down in the bottom somewhere, and but it was just so thick with overgrowth. So Dr. Smith decided he was going to purchase some land south of Rolling Shoals Ford on the Cossatot River. So Pigpen Bottoms, where they would always lose this woman, was located between Rolling Shoals Ford and the Smith, Dr. Smith's farm. So from his farm on the bottoms, it was very thick and forested, and so Dr. Smith figured somewhere in all of this thick forested area, somewhere close to the river, has to be the mine, is what he reasoned. So he hired some men to clear the land for him, and they started clearing land, and he started planting crops, and they created more and more cropland, and as the years are going by, he's clearing more land and planting more crops, and hoping that one of these days he's going to run across this mine down there. But once a huge amount of land was cleared, he did finally find the mine, and they found the shaft was near vertical, so there were lots of pilings and tailings and everything outside of this mine, and so they could tell it had been excavated extensively. But they lowered people down, by ropes and stuff, and they could only get about 30 feet down into the mine, and then there was water. So at this point, Dr. Smith knows that, well, there's nothing much we can do, right now. But in the 1920s, if you remember anything about the 1920s and what went on in a lot of the Midwest and even larger area of the country than that, you had the Dust Bowl. So it was not raining hardly at all for a lot of the 1920s. So you had a drought. And the Cossatot River dried up nearly completely. It was mostly just a trickle of a creek or so. And so in the 1920s, once there really hadn't been any rain for a while, people tried to go back down, and I believe at this time they got back down in the vertical shaft, and they were able to get 150 feet down. Now I don't know if the shaft was vertical a complete 150 feet, or if they went down, like 75 feet and then got 75 feet more down the tunnel, but that part wasn't vertical. It didn't say exactly. I'm sure things still angled, down into the earth, but anyhow, at the 75-foot mark, they found a Spanish hammer, or what they assumed was a Spanish hammer. It was found like hammered into one of the timber supports, I believe, and they took it out and they brought it up, up out of the mine and had a look at it, and it had gold flecks that were adhered to it, like it had been used to hammer out a lot of gold. And so it had gold flecks adhered to it. It had been looked at by experts, and it had been ID'd to be cast in Seville, Spain during the 1500s. So they ID'd this as a Spanish hammer cast, in those days. So now they're putting some credence to the story of the Castilian Spanish-speaking woman and the Spanish tools. And as they're down in the mine, they find some more Spanish artifacts. So at this point, they can determine that the Spanish gold mine story does appear to be true. And in 1927, they have even more severe drought at that point, and the water goes even lower. But at this point where they're able to get to now, it's silted in really good. So the tunnel is all silted in. They can't go to the end of the tunnel yet. So they decide, well, there's all this silt down here. We got to use buckets, and I think they just, a bucket at a time, they kept bringing more and more and more of the silt out, and they worked nonstop. I think the report said they worked nonstop pretty much for about 2 weeks, with lanterns and buckets, and they really wanted to get as much of that silt and dirt out of there that they could, and see if they could continue to go down the tunnel. They figured probably if they got to the end of the tunnel, they would get to where there may still be a rich vein of gold that was being dug out when the Spanish abandoned the mine, but they didn't know for sure. So around this time, though, after a couple weeks of digging silt out and still not getting to the end of the tunnel, it starts to heavily rain for a couple of days. So the men returned to their homes and just kind of, relaxed a bit and waited. So they figured, well, it'll rain a little bit, and when it's done raining, then we'll go back in and we'll continue the process. Well, that rain turned to more rain, and it became the Great Flood of 1927. So soon, all of Pigpen Bottoms was underwater, and it continued across the floodplain where the mine was located. So when the Cossatot River, which was a raging river at this time now, when it receded, there was a whole new thick layer of silt in the bottoms and on the floodplain and everything. And the diggers eventually returned to the bottoms and the plain and everything, and with this new thick layer of silt, at first they couldn't find the mine. They couldn't figure out, wait, where was this at? And they eventually did locate it again, and they found it under 3 feet of new sediment. So at that point, they started trying to, dig things out a bit, but obviously the water is just too high at that point. They must have dug the sediment away so that they could keep track of, well, this is where the mine is, and And if it had filled completely up with silt, it was going to be a heck of a lot to excavate. Well, they knew had already gone 150 feet when they got to the silt before. So at this point, it was going to be a heck of a long dig or whatever to get all of the silt out of there if it's silted in all the way. So at this point, they just kind of gave up for the time being, and probably expected to possibly come back at some time in the future. Maybe not, but maybe we'll never know until there's a real good drought again, and with some current tools, maybe they're able to dig things out a lot more. But at this point, the reports say the mine it's still there, but it may be all silted in. But the people that saw the gold that came out of it said that it was some of the richest gold that they had ever seen. So that is the story of the lost gold mine on the Cossatot River in southwest Arkansas. So if you like these kind of stories, like and subscribe to my channel.